Before we get rolling, make sure to like the video and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. New Mexico Territory, December 1882. Night settling in hard. The wind had been picking up since dusk, sliding down from the northern peaks with a bite sharp enough to chew through wool and settle straight into a man's ribs. Dry snow slashed sideways across the ridge, drifting like white smoke under a starless sky. The night was heavy, pressing low, and the cold in Abel Harkin's chest didn't feel any different from the cold outside his cabin walls. The fire inside the old iron stove still glowed, but just barely. He'd fed it the driest pine he had stashed in the shed, and now its belly burned a stubborn red. His hands, roughened, cracked, slow with winter stiffness, moved in their usual rhythm. Heat the room, cook a little, clean the tools, sharpen the knife, check the latch, load the rifle. Sit, say nothing. The cabin was nothing fancy. One room, log walls sealed with packed mud, a narrow window crusted with frost, a cot he never bothered to make, a chair by the stove, another near the door, and a table with a basin beside it. One spare blanket. No pictures, no memories hanging on the walls. He was 38, worn thin by years of fighting, writing reports nobody read, and being forgotten when the army no longer needed him. He'd survived 2 brutal campaigns that ended in blame and burial mounds, then got discharged after a failed Utah mission where he was the only man who made it back. He never asked to leave. They simply stopped sending orders, stopped answering letters. 5 years had passed since. He settled out here because no one else wanted the land. Dust in the summer, ice in the winter, too far from town and too close to old Apache paths. That suited him fine. No neighbors, no saloons, no church bells, no pity. Just a mule named Noel, a few fences he built himself, and enough silence to keep the past buried. Until tonight. At first he chalked it up to the wind, a shift in its rhythm. Then another sound came, not a knock, not a boot step, something weaker, a dragging scuff, followed by a dull thump. He was on his feet before he knew it, instincts from old battles tightening every nerve. His hand touched the rifle but didn't raise it. He eased to the door, leaned his shoulder against it, listening. Nothing. Then again, scratching. Not on the wood, but on the frozen step just outside. He unlatched the door. What he saw locked the breath in his throat. A woman. Barefoot, kneeling, nearly collapsed, skin mottled red and purple from the cold. Her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder and hem, soaked from melted snow. Strands of beadwork clung to shredded tassels. Wet black hair clung to her face and trailed down her back in frozen ropes. Her arms trembled violently as she tried to keep herself upright. Her eyes lifted to his, not pleading at first, just searching him, trying to decide whether he'd strike her or let her speak. Then she whispered, voice cracked and fading. "I can serve, if you want. Just not outside." It wasn't seduction. It wasn't even clear. It was survival. Abel felt something tighten in his chest, not desire, not pity, recognition. This wasn't a trick. She wasn't bargaining for comfort. She was trying not to die on his doorstep. He stepped back, opened the door wider. She blinked, disbelieving, before her arms finally gave out. Her body dropped forward, hitting the floorboards with a soft, lifeless thud, curling in on itself like wet cloth. He shut the door fast. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Kneeling beside her, he reached for her shoulder. She flinched. "Easy," he said, voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer, only tightened in fear. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her toward the fire. She weighed barely anything, stiff as a frozen branch, Her feet were blocks of ice. Her skin burned with cold, and under the torn deerskin he felt raised welts and bruises. He laid her on a folded horse blanket near the stove, close enough for warmth, but far from the flame. She stirred faintly, eyes opening just enough to whisper, "Please, you can have me. I won't fight." Abel shook his head sharply. "No." She stared, confused, as if the word didn't fit anything she understood. "You don't owe me a thing," he said. She looked stunned by the idea. He crossed the room, pulled out a second blanket, dry socks, and a boiled shirt far too big for her. He set them beside her without touching her, then crouched at the stove, stoking the flames until heat filled the room. She strained to sit upright, hands shaking. She slipped the shirt on over her torn dress, fumbling with stiff fingers. Abel looked away. A moment passed. "Why?" she whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he filled a tin cup with hot coffee and set it in front of her before taking a seat across the fire. She watched the cup for a long moment, then lifted it with trembling hands and drank. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded. Outside, the storm hammered the cabin. Inside, for the first time in 5 long winters, Abel Harkin wasn't alone. The blizzard raged through the night, pounding the roof, whining through the cracks in the logs, testing every inch of the cabin. But the fire held, and Abel stayed awake long after Nita, though he didn't yet know her name, fell still beside the stove. Abel didn't sleep. He sat in the corner chair, arms folded across his chest, coat still on, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the blanket near the stove. The woman, Nita, though he didn't know that yet, didn't cry in her sleep, didn't make a sound, but her body twitched now and then, like she braced for a blow. Sometime past midnight, she jolted upright with a sharp gasp, reaching down to her legs. When she realized she was still covered, still warm, still untouched, she eased herself back down in silence. Abel said nothing. He didn't offer the cot. That would have been too much. Too close. Too soon. He hadn't let anyone near it in years. Around 2 a.m., he stood, ladled more coffee into the tin cup, and drank it while standing by the window. Snow scraped across the outer wall like fingernails. Out in the shed, Buckshot and Noel were quiet. He'd checked on them earlier. Now everything was still, except the storm and the steady sound of her breathing. She shifted again under the blanket. Her feet. He remembered the raw flesh, cracked and bleeding, dirt frozen into the skin. Her fingers, too, purple at the tips. If she'd collapsed 10 feet farther from the door, she'd have frozen to death. No doubt. He turned from the window and returned to the chair, his eyes on the fire, trying not to think. He never asked himself why he let her in. The answer was too plain. He just knew he couldn't leave someone out in the cold again. Not again. The morning arrived slow and gray, like ash falling through the window. The wind had settled, but the cold remained. Outside, the world was locked in ice. Nothing moved. Inside, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, found the fire, then the chair, then him. She sat up too quickly. The blanket fell from her shoulders, and she winced, clutching it around her chest where the neckline of her torn dress had slipped again. Her hair, knotted and damp, clung to her face. She backed up a few inches, breath shallow and quick. Abel didn't budge. "You're safe," he said quietly. She stared hard, lips dry and cracked. Her fingers trembled, even wrapped in cloth. "You didn't." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't." She watched him for a long beat, and something in her shoulders gave just a little. Not trust. Something closer to surrender. She wrapped the blanket around her tightly and leaned back against the wall. Abel rose, moved to the stove, and poured the last of the beans into a small bowl. He warmed it over the coals without looking at her. "I got food," he said. "Ain't much, but it's hot." She didn't answer. When the beans were ready, he set the bowl on the floor and backed away, sitting down across from her. She waited a long time before inching forward. Her hands were stiff. She fumbled the spoon. She ate slowly, pausing between bites to glance up at him, like a caged animal waiting for the snare to spring. "You Apache?" Abel asked at last. She nodded once. "Name?" Nothing. Silence. He didn't press. She finished eating, placed the bowl down gently, and after a breath, spoke. "Nita." He nodded, didn't offer his own name, just leaned back, arms crossed. "Where from?" Her eyes dropped to the fire. No answer for a while. "North," she said finally. 2 days walking. Maybe 3. No shoes. Lost count. "Alone?" She nodded again, this time slower. He let it sit. Questions could wait. He rose, picked up the bowl, and rinsed it in the basin. She watched him with quiet eyes, confused by how calmly he moved, how he didn't ask for anything. When he turned around again, she was trying to stand. He stepped forward, fast, but she held up a hand. Bracing herself on the wall, she pushed to her feet, wobbling, barely holding steady. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands. "I need to go," she said. Abel shook his head. "You leave now, you freeze." She looked at the door, then back at him. "You didn't touch me, didn't take. You don't want me here." "I didn't say that." She didn't look like she believed him. He gestured toward the fire. "You stay till you can walk without falling over." "I can go." "You can barely stand." Her eyes flared, not in fear, but pride. It struck him deeper than he expected. She wasn't trying to run. She just didn't want to be a burden. "I got room," he said softer now. "And I got water. Beans. You don't owe me." She gripped the edge of the table a moment longer. Then, finally, she lowered herself back down by the stove. She didn't thank him, but she stayed. That was enough. He returned to his chair, stared at the fire. 2 strangers, quiet, watching flames, not figuring each other out, just wondering if the world would ever give them a moment's peace. The next morning brought colder air. The snow hadn't stopped. A fresh drift sealed the cabin door shut. Abel had to shove it open with his shoulder just to check. Outside, the snow rose to his thigh, smooth, untouched. He didn't go far, just out to the shed. Checked Noel, brushed snow off the roof slope, brought in another armload of wood. 20 minutes out there left his hands stinging, even through gloves. Inside, the fire had faded to low orange coals. Cold crept in again. Nita sat up near the stove, still wrapped tight in the oversized shirt he'd given her. She didn't speak, but she watched him now with clearer eyes, posture straighter. Not running, not trusting, but different. He stomped off the snow, dropped the wood, and fed the fire. Flames sparked and caught. The warmth slowly returned, like something earned. She held her hands out toward it. He noticed the swelling in her fingers, the split skin at the tips. The cloth she'd wrapped them in had dark spots now, blood soaked through. Abel pulled a bundle of old cloth strips from a crate near the cot, boiled undershirts, clean and dry. He walked back and knelt beside her. She stiffened. "I won't touch unless you want me to," he said, voice low, steady. After a pause, she slowly held out her hands, fingers trembling. He sat cross-legged across from her and gently unwound the rags she'd wrapped herself. Her fingers were in worse shape than he expected. Deep splits, blackened nail beds, the kind of cold damage that left scars even after healing. He worked quietly in the firelight, cleaning what he could with warm water, drying each fingertip, rewrapping them in fresh cloth. She never flinched. Her eyes stayed on him the entire time. When he finished, she lowered her hands into her lap, studying them like they didn't belong to her. "Thank you," she whispered. Abel nodded once and rose to his feet. Her gaze drifted slowly across the room, taking it in like it was the first time she really saw it. The empty cot, the hanging pans, tin plates stacked on the shelf, a rifle mounted on the wall. Then her eyes paused at the chair where his coat hung. "You live here alone?" she asked. "5 winters now." "No wife?" she pressed. He shook his head. "No." She didn't question it, but her eyes stayed on him a little longer than necessary. Later that morning, Abel stirred cornmeal mush into the same dented tin pot, thickening it with a handful of dried beans. It wasn't much, but it filled the cabin with the smell of warmth instead of smoke. He ladled some into a bowl and handed it to her. She tried to take it, but her fingers slipped. He caught the bowl mid-air and set it gently down before her. She muttered something in Apache he didn't catch. Then, after a moment, softer. "You give before you take." He didn't respond. "You don't eat until I eat," she added. "Habit," he said simply. She watched him. He felt it, but didn't look up. He just scooped his portion and sat by the fire. They ate in silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was new, cautious, careful. Midday, she stood for the first time without shaking. 3 paces. No stumbles. He didn't move to help. Didn't even rise. Just watched. She stopped at the window, rested one hand on the frost-rimmed sill, and looked out. "All white," she murmured. "Storm won't break today. You're stuck same as me." "Yeah," he said. She turned slightly toward him. "Why do you live this far out?" He didn't answer at first. That was a question he never liked. But she stood there waiting. "No one to bury out here," he said finally. She didn't ask what he meant, not right away. She nodded like maybe she understood more than most would, then took 2 more steps and leaned against the wall. "You're not like other white men," she said, not looking at him. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't want praise, didn't feel like he'd earned it. He just didn't want to be whatever it was she'd been running from. She turned toward him, arms crossed over her chest, hiding the tear in her dress. "I don't have another," she said. "Another what?" "Dress, shoes, anything. They took everything." He didn't pity her. Just nodded once. He understood too well. "I've got a spare blanket," he said. "You could tie it like a shawl till we figure something better." She hesitated. "Will you help me?" He stood, crossed the room, and pulled a wool blanket from the cot. He held it open. She turned her back, arms still crossed. He wrapped it over her shoulders. She reached back with one hand and took the ends. As he helped knot it behind her neck, his fingers brushed the back of her dress. He stepped away quickly. She turned to face him again. This time, she didn't lower her eyes. She held his gaze. And for the first time, there wasn't fear in it, just exhaustion and something quieter. Clarity. That night, Abel didn't sleep on the cot. He rolled out his bed on the far side of the cabin near the rifle. Kept his coat on. Nita curled beneath the blanket by the stove, back turned to him. The fire glowed low. The room held stillness. Not tension. Not suspicion. She didn't offer herself again. and he didn't have to say no. She knew now she was safe, that she could stay. It was the first night they slept in the same room, not as strangers, but as people learning to share silence without fear. The snow stopped just before dawn. Abel didn't notice by sight, but by the way the light softened through the frosted window. Cleaner, clearer. The wind had gone still. For the first time in days, the silence outside matched the stillness within. He rose quietly. The fire had burned down. His breath fogged in the air as he moved. Nita still slept near the stove, curled beneath the blanket. Her face had softened. Not peaceful, but not braced either. She looked younger in sleep, less guarded. He didn't wake her. Instead, he stepped outside. The cold cut deep, but it was different now. Clean, open, like something washed the land clear. Everything was buried in white, the slope of the roof, the outline of the shed, half sunken in drift. His boots crunched as he crossed to the shed. Noel gave a soft grunt. Buckshot, slower as always, blinked once and watched him. Abel mucked the stall, broke the crust of ice in the trough, and fed both animals from the hay rack. Every movement was quiet, efficient, familiar, but his mind wasn't on chores. It was back in that cabin. When he returned, Nita was awake. She sat cross-legged with her back to the stove. The blanket wrapped snug around her, the oversized shirt still beneath it. Her hair was tied back roughly with a strip of leather. She looked at him as he stepped through the door. Not startled. Just watching. "Your horse sounds old," she said evenly. Abel stomped the snow off his coat and closed the door behind him. "Older than the mule," he said, "but steadier." "Older than the mule," Abel said, "but steadier." Nita nodded. "Mules are loud. Yours would be too, with snow that deep." It was the first joke he'd made since she arrived. Quiet, dry, but it landed. A faint twitch pulled at the corner of her mouth. Just a flicker of a smile, or maybe something close to it. Abel pulled off his gloves, set them near the stove, and started on breakfast. Cornmeal again, this time with a pinch of salt. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He didn't have to. When it was ready, she moved to sit at the table without prompting. No questions, no chatter. Just a slight nod of thanks before she began to eat. Her movements were smoother now, less fragile. A few bites in, her gaze drifted around the room. "You always live like this?" she asked. "This way, alone, quiet, no mess." He shrugged. "No one to make a mess for." She considered that. "Not lonely?" He hesitated. Then, "No." But she didn't believe him. He could see that. After breakfast, she stood and paced the perimeter of the cabin, testing her balance, reclaiming her footing. At the window, she wiped frost away with her palm and stared out across the ridge. "How far to town?" she asked. "Half a day by horse? Longer on foot?" He nodded once. "You go often? Once a month for supplies?" "More or less." She turned back toward him. "I want to help." He looked up from where he was rinsing the pot. "Help with what?" "Work, something. Anything. You're still healing." "I've still got hands." He studied her a moment. This wasn't desperation speaking. It was declaration. An insistence that her presence here wasn't charity. She wanted to earn her space. "There's a basin out behind the shed," he said. "If we break the ice, we can boil some water. Sort what's still usable." She headed toward the door, barefoot. "Wait," he said. He crossed to the cot, rummaged beneath it, and pulled out a pair of worn socks and cracked leather boots, scuffed and too big by a few sizes. "They won't fit." "They'll do," she said. He helped her lace them. She didn't flinch when his hands touched her ankles. The skin was raw from frostbite, but healing. Outside, the sky had opened, pale blue stretching wide over the ridge. Pines framed the horizon, and patches of brush peeked through the snow. Cold still bit, but it was the kind you could breathe through. She moved slow, careful steps through the drifts. He stayed close, not hovering, but close enough. At the basin, he broke the ice with the blunt side of an axe head, scooped water into buckets. She took one without being asked and carried it back inside. She set it on the stove to boil, then knelt by the corner where her torn dress lay. She picked it up with care, examined the damage, and began cleaning it. Her focus was absolute, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. Every thread she pulled, every bead she saved, it wasn't for him. She wasn't repairing it for show. She was restoring it for herself. And he understood that. Later, standing at the table with steam rising from the soaked cloth, she asked quietly, not looking at him, "Do you have a needle?" He fetched the small tin he kept near the rifle oil. She took it gently, threaded it with dark sinew, and began to stitch. From his chair, Abel watched, arms folded. "You're good at that," he said. "My mother made me learn," she answered. "She said if I ever had nothing, I should still know how to fix what was mine." "That's a good lesson." She looked up briefly. "Most men I've met didn't think so." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. By nightfall, the repaired dress hung from a line across the room, drying. The cabin smelled like boiled leather, hot water, and smoke. She handed the boots back. "Keep them," he said. "They're yours now? I've got another pair." She hesitated, then said, "Thank you." He nodded. They ate at the table that night. 2 bowls, 2 spoons. No conversation. But the silence between them had softened. Not comfort exactly, but something close. A shared stillness. Permission to exist side by side. Before bed, she folded the blanket herself. Laid it by the stove, didn't wait for him. Then turned to him and said, "Good night." It was the first time she'd spoken the last word. He stood by his bedroll, stilling for a moment. "Good night, Nita." And for the first time in years, Abel Harkin said someone's name aloud. And it didn't hurt to say it. By the 4th morning, they'd found a rhythm. Abel rose first, fed the fire, tended to buckshot and knoll. Nita waited until the air warmed, then boiled water, set out 2 bowls without asking. She didn't ask if she could help. She just moved through the cabin like it belonged to her, and in some quiet way, it did. When he came back in, she stood at the basin, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hands were still wrapped in cloth, but she moved with confidence. Her hair was pulled into a single braid down her back, damp from washing. "Snow's easing off," he said, tugging off his gloves. "Might thaw enough for a trip to town in 2 days." She gave a quiet nod. "You go then? For coffee? Powder? Flour?" "Yeah, I'll go alone. I always do." This time she didn't look away when she asked, "You want me gone by then?" The question hit like frost cracking timber. Sharp, unavoidable. He didn't answer right away. Just hung his coat on the peg. She turned back to the basin, dipped a cloth in warm water, wrung it out. Her arms were stiff, braced. She didn't press. But the question lingered in the air like damp smoke. At last, Abel spoke. "You can stay as long as you want." She froze, hands mid-motion in the basin. "Even after I'm strong?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes." Silence. "No one's ever said that to me before," she whispered. He didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. That afternoon, the sky cleared. The clouds broke wide, and sunlight poured across the ridge like polished glass. They stood outside together for the first time. She wrapped in a blanket patchworked from old wool, him holding a kettle to catch snowmelt. He glanced sideways as she stared out across the horizon. "What do you see out there?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, quiet as a breeze through pine, she said, "I'm looking for something that doesn't want to hurt me." Abel didn't answer, didn't press. When they stepped back inside, Nita paused just beyond the door. Her fingers grazed the wood grain where the wall met the frame, like she was grounding herself in something real. Then she turned and looked at him. "You had a wife once." He didn't flinch, but the weight in his reply didn't hide. "Yeah." She waited. "She died before the war ended. Fever. We didn't have medicine. Didn't have time." Her face didn't shift, but her eyes did. Just enough. Something softened behind them. "You still love her?" "I think about her," he said. "But I don't wait for her to come back. That's not love. That's holding on to a ghost." Nita took a step closer, slow, not cautious, intentional. "You bury her here?" "No, back in Texas, before I came out this way." He figured that'd be the end of it, but she asked, "You came here to forget?" He met her gaze. "No, I came here to stop having to explain." She understood. Maybe more than anyone else could have. She didn't speak again for a long while, but that night, something had shifted between them. At supper, she sat closer. Didn't wait for him to start. And when he poured the coffee after, her hand reached across the table. Not for the cup, but for his. Her fingers, still bandaged in places, rested lightly on the back of his hand. Warm. He froze. She didn't pull away. "You don't touch unless I let you," she said softly. "No," he replied. She nodded, her eyes locked on his. "This time I let you." He didn't grab, didn't lean in. He just turned his palm upward under hers, letting them rest together, skin to skin on the table. No pain, no transaction, no fear. Just choice. When she finally stood, she didn't say goodnight. Didn't need to. He watched her lay out the bedroll by the fire, wrap herself in the blanket, settle in without glancing back. And he knew, without question, she felt safe now. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, so did he. The wind outside had died completely. The world held still, like it had stopped breathing. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low and steady. Shadows flickered on the log walls, not wild or restless, just calm and slow, like old ghosts settling into their chairs for the night. Abel sat in his chair, one boot hooked across the other knee, his eyes half-lidded as he watched the fire curl and dance. Nita sat closer to the stove, wrapped in her cleaned and repaired deerskin dress, the gray wool blanket tied around her shoulders. She had just finished brushing out her hair, slow, even strokes from crown to tip. The wooden comb lay across the table. She hadn't asked to use it. She didn't need to. After 4 days, a rhythm had formed between them, a quiet agreement. There were places in this cabin that were hers now, by the fire, at the table, in the doorway when she stepped outside to breathe. And Abel never intruded. He didn't ask about her past. Didn't need to. Some pain spoke louder in silence, in the way someone stepped, or how they braced when the wind changed, or how they never slept with their back to an open room. Nita didn't flinch anymore. And that night, for the first time, she turned away from the fire, not toward her bedding, but toward him. She stood slowly. No performance, No dramatics, just a choice. He watched her cross the room, step by step. She stopped in front of him. Close enough he could see the red around her knuckles, the faded burns on her wrist. She didn't speak, just knelt in front of him, resting her hands on her thighs. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, breath steady but chest tight, not with nerves, but with the weight of something real. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," she replied. "You don't have to do this." "I'm not doing anything," she said. And it wasn't cold. It wasn't defensive, just honest. "I'm just sitting here." He nodded. She reached out and lifted his hand, held it between both of hers, ran her thumbs gently across the rough skin, the scar tissue from rope and blade and years of work. She didn't shy from the damage. "You fought in a war," she murmured. He nodded. She brushed the scar along his jaw, barely touching, then pulled her hand back. "So did I," she said. This time, he looked at her fully. Their eyes met. And for the first time since she'd collapsed on his doorstep, the silence between them wasn't about fear or caution. It was understanding. It was permission. She lowered her head gently against his knee. He didn't move. After a long second, he let his hand hover over her hair, then rested it there. No pressure, no demand, just presence. She closed her eyes. The fire cracked once. Outside, the snow shimmered blue under moonlight. And inside that cabin, they stayed like that. A woman who'd walked through fire. A man who'd buried ghosts, not clinging, not grasping, just breathing the same air, by the same warmth, under the same roof. The morning came slow, unannounced. No beam of sunlight, just a quiet brightening through the frost-laced window, like someone turned the world up a notch. The sky hung flat and pale over the white land, every inch of snow reflecting it like a silent mirror. Inside, the fire had burned down to steady coals. Abel was already up, boots on, coat half-buttoned, rifle in hand. He hadn't said a word, hadn't looked at her. But the way he moved, the tight line of his shoulders told Nita something was wrong. Nita sat up slowly on the bedroll, the blanket pulled tight around her. "What is it?" she asked. Abel didn't answer right away. He stood at the door, one hand resting on the bolt, his gaze fixed. "Footprints," he said at last. She was on her feet in an instant, the cold forgotten. "How many?" "2," he replied, voice calm, clipped, focused. "Could be riders who turned back. Could be they circled. I don't know yet." She stepped up beside him, barefoot but unfazed, peering through the thin crack near the stove, where the wood had shrunk over time. The slope down to the ridge was visible. Nothing moved. "Do they know you're here?" she asked. "Maybe, maybe not." He turned to face her then, meeting her gaze straight on. "You ever handle a rifle?" She nodded once. "Better with a bow, but I can shoot." He handed her his sidearm from the shelf. It was heavy, worn smooth where the leather met years of calloused hands. He didn't give instructions, didn't need to. She took it like she'd held steel before. "There's a crate by the table. Shells inside, if it comes to that. You stay low. What about you?" "I'm heading out 20 paces. Try to read their direction." "You sure?" "No, but I need to know." He stepped outside and shut the door with slow, careful hands. Nita moved fast. She opened the chamber, loaded each round with deliberate focus. Her fingers, though wrapped and tender, didn't shake. She checked the action twice, Then she crouched low beside the stove, keeping the gun pointed toward the door. Her pulse thundered in her ears, every creak in the rafters, every groan in the logs, sharper now, time stretched thin. Then, footsteps. She raised the pistol, leveled it steady. The door opened. Abel stepped through. She lowered the weapon without a word. "Boot tracks headed south," he said, snow melting off his coat. "No horse prints, just deep, heavy steps. Could mean they're on foot. Armed. Likely looking for someone." "Looking for you?" she asked. "Maybe. Maybe not. Could be anyone. But the trail's fresh. They came close." She didn't ask what came next. She didn't have to. "I'll start packing supplies," she said. Abel nodded. No argument, just turned and picked up the blanket near her bedding, handed it to her. "We leave by midday. Take the North Ridge Trail. There's cover there." She nodded back. He paused just a second, then laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "You okay?" Her eyes met his. Steady. "I'm tired of running," she said. "But I'll follow you if you lead." That stayed with him longer than he meant it to. By the time the sun broke through, the snow softened just enough to leave tracks. Their footprints stretched in a clean line away from the cabin, leading north toward the high pass where the scrub brush grew thick and the wind couldn't see you coming. They didn't speak much, but they walked side by side. Neither looked back. That part mattered. The ridge trail wasn't much of a path, just a worn line between pine roots and weathered stone. An old game trail, half buried under snow, climbing sharp and narrow through broken brush and rock. Shadows held snow in their cracks. The crest had thawed just enough to keep the boots biting into ground. Crunch, crunch, soft powder, dirt, breath. Abel walked ahead, rifle slung but ready, eyes moving like they always did, watching for more than just tracks. Nita followed close, pistol tucked beneath the folds of her blanket, her hands steady, her pace strong. She didn't lag, didn't speak. The cold didn't bite like before. What lingered wasn't the wind. It was the feeling of being watched. They rounded a switchback, and Nita pulled up short. "There," she whispered, pointing back down the ridge. Abel turned, his eyes scanning. Sharp, trained, deep boot prints below, wide set, angled, fresh. "They circled," he said low. "Didn't follow, just watching. Wanted to see if the place was still lived in." "Think they saw us leave?" "Doubt it, but they're near." They pressed on. By late afternoon, the sky had turned again, clouds rolling in, dimming the day in a wash of steel and ash. Abel led them toward a place he hadn't seen in years. An old hunter's lean-to, half collapsed, wedged into the north side of a rock face. 3 posts, brush wall, timber roof. Barely held up, but better than nothing. When they reached it, Nita ducked inside first. It was cold, but dry. She set her pack down, just a blanket, a biscuit, the revolver. Then turned to him. "This'll hold tonight." He nodded. "We'll leave at sunrise. Cut west along the creek trail. That'll take us away from the cabin." She crouched, started clearing space for a fire. He didn't stop her. He moved into the trees, collecting pine, dry stuff, light, brittle. Years of habit in every motion. She struck the flint herself. Took her 3 tries. But she got it. A spark caught. The fire grew. Small. Real. They didn't say much while they worked, but the silence had weight now. Not emptiness. Understanding. He laid his coat beside her. She sat on it without question. After they shared the last strips of dried meat and a broken biscuit, She added another log to the fire. Flames rose, reflecting against the stone, orange dancing across their faces, the only light for miles. Abel sat with his back to the rock, rifle at his side. "You think they'll follow?" she asked. "Hard to say." "If they do, will you fight?" He met her eyes. "Only if I have to." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I used to think killing changed you," she said, "but I think being hunted changes you worse." He didn't argue. Her voice lowered, not afraid, just tired. "I don't want to keep running." "You don't have to," he said. "Not with me." Silence settled thick and quiet. Then she moved. Not with urgency, not with hesitation. Just purpose. She crossed the space between them and sat beside him, not touching, but close enough that her knee brushed his. And that was enough. Abel didn't move away. Her hands were cold, tucked beneath the blanket, but she leaned into him, just enough to feel real. "You still don't touch unless I ask," she whispered. "I don't?" She looked up. "Then I'm asking." He turned his head toward her. Slowly, deliberately, he slid his arm around her shoulders, settling it over the blanket. She leaned into the space he made for her. No tension, no rush, just warmth, the fire on her cheeks, the steady beat of him beside her. They didn't speak. There was no kiss, no clumsy reach, just silence between two people who had survived long enough to stop bracing against peace. Outside, the ridge was still. Snow drifted again, light as breath. The fire snapped softly. Cold stayed on the far side of the rock wall. And for the first time since leaving the cabin, they didn't just sleep beside each other. They slept close, because they wanted to. They woke before dawn. Nita stirred first. She hadn't moved much through the night. Her head had rested on Abel's chest, and now it rose and fell with the slow rhythm of his breath. His arms still circled her shoulders, not possessive, just there. When she shifted slightly, he opened his eyes but said nothing. The fire had dwindled to embers and ash. Cold crept in again, but neither of them reached for distance. They sat up together in the hush of morning. Then she asked, soft as smoke, "Do you still want to keep moving?" Abel rubbed his jaw. "I've thought about it. I don't want trouble showing up at that cabin, but we can't keep running either." She nodded, her eyes on the fading coals. "I've been running since I was 16, she said. "I don't even remember what it feels like, to plant something and stay long enough to watch it grow." He looked at her, the firelight casting her face in soft gold. "We could try," he said. She turned toward him. "You'd do that? Start over? Somewhere else?" "Not alone," he said. That landed heavy, not as burden, but as promise. They broke camp soon after, packed the blanket, kicked snow over the coals, brushed away all signs they'd ever been there. Abel scanned the land below with the calm, exact eye of a scout. No tracks, no broken brush, no shadow where one didn't belong. They turned west, following the old creek trail, an old route he used to trap before winter set in. It ran through narrow gullies and low trees, terrain hard to track and harder to trail. It was good country for starting over. Nita walked beside him, not behind. Her steps were measured. She still limped slightly, frostbite still tender. But she never asked to stop. Around midday, they paused by a bend in the frozen creek. Abel crouched to check the water beneath the ice. Nita stood watch, her eyes fixed on the ridge across the way. Then they heard it. Distant voices, low, not close enough to see, but deep enough to feel in the chest. Two men, Speaking not quite English, Nita crouched instantly. Abel moved behind a pine, motioned for her to stay low. His rifle came up, ready but not aimed. He listened. The voices drifted, southbound, moving away. She met his eyes. Bounty hunters? Maybe, he said. But they're not tracking. Didn't stop. Didn't check sign. She waited. We keep going. They didn't speak again until they reached the bluff. Below stretched a long, flat plain. Dry brush, rocky soil, a grove of cedar trees nestled at the halfway mark. Abel stopped at the overlook. Quiet. This could work, he said. Nita stepped beside him. Her gaze scanned like his. Water's west, about 3 miles. Spring-fed. Soil's hard, but it'll break if we work it. He nodded. Room enough for a cabin? More than enough, she said. She exhaled slowly. Not relief, but resolve. Then let's build something. He turned toward her. You sure? She nodded. You said not alone. I meant it. She stepped closer, her hand rising to his cheek. Her fingers were warm now, despite the cold. He leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers. Then she kissed him. Not desperate, not uncertain. Just slow and steady, a kiss that said, I'm still here. When they pulled apart, she smiled, faint but full. The first real one. Abel reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of worn leather. From it, he took a small wooden-handled knife. He turned to the nearest cedar and carved a single notch into the bark. Then another. Then 4 more. What are you doing? She asked, tilting her head. Marking the first day, he said. If we're staying, we need to start counting. Nita stepped forward, took the knife, carved one beneath his, smaller, slanted, but hers. 1 start, 2 people, no one chasing them. Just sky, just earth, just space to begin. The land hadn't warmed, but it had become familiar. Weeks passed. Since they marked that tree, the sky had shifted. The creek had thawed. The hard ground had given just enough for fence posts and shovel blades. The soil wasn't kind, but neither were they. They didn't need easy. They just needed each other. Not anymore. They both knew how to make things last now, with hands that didn't quit, even when they trembled from cold or stiffened from long work. The cabin rose slow, 1 wall at a time. Abel cut and placed every beam with care. Nita hauled stones from the ridge, shaping a foundation ring like her father once taught her. Just rope, mud, and patience. No drawings, no plans, just memory, instinct, and trust. They didn't speak about the past. Didn't need to. They only talked about what was needed now. Timber, water, food, and each other. Inside the half-framed cabin, the stove from Abel's old place sat in the center, already burning. They'd dragged it across the valley in pieces on a makeshift sledge, Nita guiding Noel and Abel pushing from behind. It took them a whole day and bloodied knuckles, but it burned hot again now, like it had always belonged. She'd made curtains from her old deerskin dress. She never said why. Just told him it didn't belong on her body anymore, but it didn't deserve to be buried either. She hung them with twine across the single window Abel had carved into the north wall. There were 2 cups on the shelf now, 2 spoons, 2 blankets folded at the edge of the cot they shared. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. One cold morning, Abel returned from checking traps, boots muddy and fingers stiff, to find Nita crouched by the stove, brushing out her hair in the firelight. Her braid had grown longer, thicker. The color had returned to her cheeks. No more cracks on her hands. No more bruises on her skin. She looked up when he stepped inside, gave him a quiet smile. You're bleeding, she said. pointing to his knuckle. He glanced down. A fresh cut from a wire snare. "Not deep," he said. She stood and crossed to him, took his hand without asking, sat him on the stool. She dipped a rag in warm water and cleaned the wound gently, without hurry. Abel watched her the whole time, the slope of her cheekbones, the soft crease of her brow, the fading scar along her jaw. When she finished, she didn't let go of his hand. "You think they'll ever come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "You worry?" He looked at her again. Not a tremor in her voice. "No fear? Just calm." "No," he answered. She leaned in and kissed him. Slower this time. Deeper. Not out of need. Not out of thanks. A kiss that said we stayed. That night they sat together on the unfinished front step, shoulders wrapped in a blanket, her bare feet tucked against his leg for warmth. The stars were sharp above. The moon hung low and wide. The trees behind them whispered faint through the dark. The roof settled with a gentle creak, like it was finally finding its place. Nita pointed upward. "My mother used to say each star was a story," she murmured. "Not just light, but something lived." Abel turned his eyes to her profile in the dark. "You ever tell one of those stories?" he asked. She looked at him, a small smile forming. "I'm living mine now." He reached over and took her hand. She didn't pull away. And when they rose and stepped inside that half-built cabin, closing the door against the cold, there wasn't a doubt left between them. Not about the land. Not about the walls. Not about what they were building. They hadn't made a life quickly. They'd made it right. One log, one fire, one choice at a time, and they stayed.